question. How do you define self-care? I know for myself, what comes to mind is an airplane. Now, for some of you all, catching flights and traveling might be a part of your self-care practice, but that's not what comes to mind for me. When I think about self-care, I think about the process of getting on the airplane, where we walk in, we have a seat, we may check bags up top, get our snacks out, put the bag under the chair for some, and then we begin listening to the stewardess who goes over the kind of rules and regulations of our travel. And one thing that every flight conversation will have is a portion where they share, if we experience turbulence, a mask will fall from the overhead, and you are to put that mask on first. Then after your family, then after the kid, you first, to assure that you're able to help others around you. When we think about self-care, that's what comes to mind for me. Taking an intentional moment to take care of yourself first. Often in life, we can be second, third, fourth, but we recognize when it comes to those self-care moments, if we're not good, we can't help others around us.
So how will we define self-care? When we think of self-care, we're going to talk throughout this presentation about a practice, something that you do intentionally and consistently. And this doesn't have to be my self-care practice is I'm going to go to Maui for 7 days, forget the kids and everyone else. But it's something that you do maybe once a week, once a month, that may take only 30 minutes or may take an hour. But it's something that you're intentional about. It's a practice of taking action to preserve or improve your own physical health. And a lot of times, self-care starts with managing chronic conditions. So really taking a look at what are the health things that I can address and be proactive about so that I can really pour into myself to live the best life possible. The practice of taking an active role in protecting one's own health and well-being and happiness is how we get to the basics of self-care. And we want to do this particularly in periods of stress. And a lot of times we can be in stressful periods and not take the time to step back and acknowledge how we're feeling or where we are based on what is going on around us. So, what is the value of self-care? Once we take this proactive step and are active in our own health and well-being, it can improve our overall health. It can help us to reduce stress and anxiety, knowing that we have that time for ourselves each month. It also can help with clarity of thoughts and work performance. So many times we don't have a self-care practice. We go, and lead a busy life. And when we don't have those moments where we're taking that step back for ourselves, we can get brain fog. These are things that are related to stress, anxiety, and depression. And we can have the compounding effects of our lifestyle that if we took a step back, we could begin to remove those extra pieces and allow us to really get to being able to perform and be efficient in the way that we desire. It also allows us to establish a better sense of our personal and professional balance. So how do we integrate our life so that we can have our work time, we can have our personal time, and we can also have that me time that is so necessary. And knowing that we have time within our schedule, that we are valuing ourselves, this can boost our self-esteem. A lot of times we can get to the end of a week, a month, or even a year, and we can think of all the things that we've done or poured into other people. But when we sit back, we realize we really didn't do anything to advance our own condition, to advance our personal health, to advance our mental well-being, to help ourselves. And that can become depressing. It can lower our self-esteem and lower our confidence in ourselves. So what are the pillars of self-care? We like to think of self-care across multiple pillars. And as we talk throughout this presentation, think about each of these aspects of your life: the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, and the mental areas of you. How are you pouring into these in an intentional way?
So let's think about, what are the barriers to self-care? When we hear the term self-care, very popular terminology now, and everyone says, go out, get self-care, achieve it, acquire it, it's good for you. Cool story. How? Right? If self-care was so easy to obtain, everyone would do it. But yet and still, we're having conversations around the need, the importance, and the value of it. So we want to take a moment just to identify what are some of the challenges that might prevent someone from acquiring, achieving, or experiencing self-care. So as we thought about the different dynamics, there were 4 barriers that kind of bubbled up or served as pillars for why someone might not be able to achieve self-care. The first being time. There are 24 hours in the day, and we think about eating, sleeping, working, a lot of time there, family, kids, the time begins to almost shrink. And all of a sudden, we see no time to go for a walk or to spend time relaxing or take a trip. And so we recognize that a limited amount of time or how time is being managed can be a barrier to self-care. The other barrier is money, financial resources. And so some may say, oh, you're stressed out. What you need is a vacation. Cool. Who's going to pay for it, right? And so just understanding that money and finances can be a challenge, on which we'll be discussing later on, for how someone can navigate or engage in self-care practices. The other is energy. So we have limited time where we're spending our time getting the money. And then we spend the money, which influences our time. And all of a sudden, we have no energy. There's plenty of times in the past where my wife and I would plan date nights, and we would get the babysitter, and we get the clothes laid out, and the kids' food put out, and all of a sudden, we have the time to do it. And all we want to do is take a nap. And so recognizing that energy, right, like energy expenditure or energy management can be a dynamic to influence self-care. And lastly, awareness. Having an awareness that you need self-care, that you have to take a second and breathe is so important. We live in a society that accomplishments can be an indicator of success. We can wake up and think of how many things do I have to do today? How much can I accomplish in a day, in a week, in a year? And all of a sudden, we've done so much but have done nothing for ourselves. And so being intentional to be aware of the value and the importance of self-care. So when we think about those various barriers, and we were to lump them all together, there was one key thing that we saw across all the different dynamics, and that were the identities we carry or the hats that we wear. To give some background, identities or hats are the different roles that we could play at any given time in our lives. Now, for many of us, we don't think about how many we have, but when we begin to pull it apart, it can be astonishing as to how many different realities and how many different roles we're playing at any given time. So the list here is just a small snapshot of the various hats that someone could be wearing at any given time. And as you look, we'll see wife, husband, mother, uncle, aunt, supervisor, employee, pastor, minister, caregiver, neighbor, activist, educator, coach. The list goes on. And all of a sudden, those different hats begin to pile up. We see how we don't have time or energy. We're going from being a dad to being an employee to then being a leader to then being an advisor to being a coach to being a dad again and to sleep. And all of a sudden, we're exhausted and we wonder why. When we think about self-care, the ability to take those hats off, if not just for a few minutes, and see not the role that we're playing, but the person who we are, allows us to really tap in and provide a space for self-care to be acquired.
You make a great point, Marcus. That's one of the values of having a self-care practice, is to take that intentional time for yourself, to sit back and think about, what are the identities that I have? How many hats am I wearing at any given moment? And being able to just take those off and be with yourself is valuable so that you can really get to the core of who you are as a person. And so what we want to talk about next is, how do we establish a self-care practice? So when we think of self-care, there's many different things that one can do. So we have examples of therapy, monthly individual activities, monthly group activities, or even just taking that intentional time with the awareness that you needed of having 2 minutes of a deep breathing exercise. Those can all be examples of self-care. Now, keeping those barriers in mind, you may say, okay, I don't have a lot of finances or resources to invest in expensive activities, but we want to encourage you that the things that we've done a lot of times can cost anywhere from $5, $10, or $20. It's just being intentional to take that time for yourself. Many times, having a therapist, you can do that through an insurance plan where you pay little to nothing or $10 for virtual visits. And so it's looking at the resources that you have and utilizing them in an intentional way.
As we continue in strategies for applying self-care, the next would be prayer and reflection. It's so important that we find time to pray, seek spiritual wisdom, and just center ourselves before God. But it's also really important for that reflection piece that we can be quiet and listen. Sometimes there are spaces where we're overwhelmed, or we're exhausted, or we're feeling away, and we're sharing our thoughts and feelings. But then allowing that reflective piece, that time for God to pour into us, to speak to us, and then to hear what's being said, can provide insight. And so as you're thinking about what might be a way for me to balance my time, my energy, my resources, allow God to give you insight through that time with Him in a quiet space. The beauty of a quiet space is it's free. And so it might be when everyone's asleep, it might be going on a walk by yourself, but allowing that time to seek spiritual insight can be and is a phenomenal way to seek self-care. The next opportunity is to engage in your purpose. And you might be wondering, Marks, what do you mean by that? For many of us in our working spaces, we're doing work to receive a financial check. And it may not be work that we find great value and meaning in. And so finding activities that align with more of your sense of enjoyment or purpose can be very edifying or rewarding. You may find joy in coaching. You might find joy in supporting others, mentoring, working at the church. There are so many different ways that we can build in activities to dedicate time in ways that make us feel better. As they say, when you're doing what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And so everyone doesn't have the opportunity to not work, right? But many of us do have the opportunity to serve in a way that's developmental and edifying for ourselves. The next would be personal affirmations. Speak life into yourself, what you're doing, what you believe in. Unfortunately, there's so much negative information that's always swirling around us. We turn the news on, negativity. We go on social media, negativity. We go outside, negativity. And that eventually, whether we want it to or not, can influence how we think, how we're processing, how we're understanding the world around us. And that can impact how you even see yourself. And so taking moments where you can speak life to you. I am loved, I have favor, I am more than a conqueror. Find ways and things that can make you feel and believe that you are who you're called to be. Now the beauty of this is also free. There are so many different personal affirmations that you can go online and find and read. If you just Google personal affirmations, and you can even be as specific. I'm looking for personal affirmations for a black father. And seeing the different words that come up allows you to pour into yourself. We'd also encourage you all to give these affirmations to your kids, if you have kids or family or friends, to allow this to be a practice you share with others around you. And lastly, physical activity. Now, I would say for me, this is one of my favorites. It's being active and getting outside. While we know being active has just physical benefits, it also can be a mental stimulant. So I run Spartan races, I go out in the woods, I hop over fires and go under barbed wire, and that might not be for everybody. But even going out for a 15-minute walk on a lunch break, or being outside and just looking at and taking in the environment around you, being mobile and moving can be a way to seek a self-care activity and to have a self-care practice. So with those strategies in mind, we want to circle back to the barriers and revisit them to talk about how do we overcome the barriers. We don't want to give you challenges without solutions. So looking through those 4 key areas, time. With time, we would encourage you to be intentional and set aside time during your week for you. It can be so easy to spend time during the week doing so many other things. Social media. 30 minutes on Instagram is like a blink of an eye. Watching a television show or just having a general conversation. Dedicate 15 minutes, just 15, to yourself. That could be a time of prayer, a time of activity or walking around, being physically active. But those 15 minutes add up. And as you begin to build your self-care practice, find ways to build in time during your week that's dedicated to yourself.
The next is money. A lot of times we think that having a self-care practice or doing things that are for ourselves has to be expensive. So for me in my self-care journey, when I realized as a young mother of 2 young children that the next is money. A lot of times we think that doing things for ourselves has to be very expensive. When I realized that I did not have a self-care practice a few years ago, I was a young mother with 2 young children and no family that lived in this state. I recognized I had to do something for myself and I needed to step away, take off all those hats, and really invest in myself. And what I did for that year was I got a membership to get a massage and a facial on a monthly basis. I didn't continue that after the year, but it was what I needed to boost my self-care practice. And so after that, I began to think about and recognize things that really give me life and energy. So you'll see money and energy a lot of times can work together. So for me, I began to think about things that I love, like flowers. How can I invest in things if I can't have fresh cut flowers every day? I can have flowers on things like the clothes that I wear, on my phone case, or on my AirPod case, things that may cost only $5 or $10. And buying something once a month for myself really helped me have things in my space that I really enjoy. So finding the things that give you energy is really important, and seeking those things out. Sometimes we intentionally or unintentionally can put ourselves in spaces and in the presence of people that really drain us. And we have to have that level of awareness to be able to say, I am going to value myself, I'm going to be aware of my surroundings, limit the energies that drain me, and make sure that I'm staying in positive and reflective spaces where I can really make sure that I'm bringing my best self to the table and my best self is being appreciated.
So let's take a moment and talk to the fellas. A quick man-to-man conversation. Gentlemen, it is so important that we find space and times to seek self-care. We all need it. If you Google self-care, 50 women pop up and 1 guy might be at the bottom of the list. But that should not be an indicator of our need for it. And so take time to be self-aware. What you need, how you recharge, and having those small steps which leads to great distances as you build out self-care practices. And so that does not mean, guys, you need to go on a guy's trip once a month. That is not it at all. It could be as simple as going to a movie, going for a walk, getting a haircut can change your life. And so finding those different ways to seek self-care that are manageable and tangible. I would also add to make sure you get support. It's not your job to navigate this journey alone. And so whether it's a therapist, a spouse, a social group at church, finding space to get plugged in and getting the support you need. I will close by saying, be cool and give yourself grace because it's a process. Many of us want to seek perfection out the gate, and that's not at all what we're doing here. We're moving toward a practice that we apply over time. And so making sure that we invest in that process and trust the process as we seek more self-care.
And so now let's talk to the ladies. I would say for women, invest in yourself without any guilt about it. A lot of times we think so much about everybody else in our life. We want to make sure our spouse is good. We want to make sure our family members are good. We want to make sure our children are doing well and everyone's okay. But I encourage you ladies, take some time alone to really invest in you. Like the example we gave earlier, if you're not putting that oxygen mask on yourself first, you cannot give to everyone else in your space in the way that you really want to and desire to. So surround yourself with joyful inspirations. For me, it is flowers. I love to have those in my space and in my environment. Find that thing that really gives you energy and put that into your space intentionally. Another thing, ladies, could be making the big move. A lot of times we feel stuck in our environments, in jobs, in activities, in services that do not serve who we are or how we're growing as people. And we cannot be afraid because sometimes we like our comfort and a lot of times we're not even comfortable. We just don't want to make any waves or make any changes. But we can't be afraid to make the big move. I did that recently in the last year in leaving my job to seek out a new place of employment. And it was the best decision I ever made. But it took me a year of thinking about it and going back and forth before I actually made that move. And I wish that I had the courage to do it earlier. But I encourage you, don't be afraid to make the big move. I would also say to give yourself first fruits. When I do things that are for myself, I'm intentional of things that I want in my space. So when I have my personal money, I spend that on myself first. So at the end of the month, sometimes we can see all the things we spend on our kids, grabbing them food, quick trips here and there. Make sure if you're saying, I need this, or I want a new pair of, let's say, $7 earrings, get that at the beginning of the month. As you're doing these things, ladies, release guilt and embrace self-love. A lot of times we don't naturally think kindly and lovingly and encourage our own self. We give that out to other people. And so I want you to take the time to be intentional and really to give yourself love as well. And for me, I like to say this saying of pack your patience, protect your peace, and I want to share that with you. Sometimes life goes so fast, we have to remember it is okay to take a break, take a pause, step back, pack your patience in the morning or on the spot if you need it, and protect your peace. Making sure that you're giving yourself that love and care in the environments that you're in. So we have a challenge for you to think about as you finish this presentation. We want you to really reflect on how many identities or hats that you wear on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. List them out if you can. And what is something that you can do intentionally to implement self-care in your life? Write it down, make a plan, and be intentional to protect your peace and to give yourself love and self-care.
So we'd like to leave you all with some final thoughts. One, be intentional to assess the need and your capacity for self-care. As we mentioned throughout our conversation today, everyone needs self-care. It's just a matter of how each person applies it to their unique circumstances. Next, manage the barriers to self-care, whether it be time, energy, or awareness. It's important that we identify what those challenges might be and then overcome them to be our best selves. Next, establishing a self-care practice. And as myself and Ashley have mentioned today, it is so important we find what works for the individual person. Some have more resources than others, some have more availability than others, and so knowing what works for you is critical to your self-care journey. And lastly, give yourself grace on your journey. It may not be perfect, but as I mentioned before, small steps lead to great distances. And so finding out what works for you today allows you to be the better self and better version of you tomorrow.
Amen. So we are going to leave you with a quote from the great Dr. Maya Angelou. As you grow older, you will discover that you have two hands, one for helping yourself, the other for helping others. So keep that in mind. Make sure that you're using your hands to help yourself first so that you can be the best version of yourself to help those in need.